All right, welcome back. We're going down to Argentina to talk to Adrian Salbucci, our columnist and colleague down there, about World War II and post-World War II history and Admiral Byrd's mysterious mission to the Antarctic and all kinds of fascinating things that occurred in history, which very few Americans are even aware of right now, but they are nonetheless every bit as fascinating as they were 50 years ago. Welcome back, Adrian.
Hello, good evening, Jeff. Great to talk to you again.
Thank you, sir. It's nice to talk to you. Now, I sent you a couple of links. I don't know if they were helpful or not. A fellow wrote a book or two about this period of time we're talking about with respect to at least two German advanced U-boats, which were equipped to carry large amounts of cargo and which showed up on Argentinian beaches after the war was over, empty. And that means they dropped their cargo off somewhere. And the cargo was obviously human in some aspect or another because they were on board, lots of space for people. So tell us, let's go back to that point in time, and maybe even prior to that, and earlier in the war and what Argentina's role, even though it was neutral, but things played out there that are very much bearing on what we're going to talk about.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You know, very often official history, as we tend to call it here, does place rather black and white dividing marks which will deform or even conform our worldview of history. So, for example, I often think, and I had an old professor who used to say down here in Argentina that we shouldn't talk about World War I and World War II. He thought rather that there was one great European Civil War that went from 1914 to 1945, and that Europe lost altogether. It wasn't just Germany and Italy that lost, but it was all of Europe in a way. So this brings you to a point that we often think that, okay, we had World War II, started in 1939, and it ended in Europe, at least, on the 8th of May of 1945 with the capitulation of Germany. However, there are many indications, and in that sense, this is something that is pretty widely studied down here in Argentina. There are many indications that things did not quite end as bluntly as official history would have us think with the capitulation of the Third Reich. So, you know, when Germany, when Admiral Dönitz actually signs the surrender of German forces, not the German state, it's important to make a point of that. It's not the German state never actually surrendered. It was the German armed forces that surrendered. There were many U-boats, in other words, submarines, and even aircraft that were outside the borders of Germany and that never bothered making it back. Actually, there are something like 100 German U-boats, submarines, that were practically unaccounted for. Now, after the war. Now, we know that there are two very specific cases because, you know, we have to divide myth from real history. So, for example, there's a myth going, and I remember when I was brought up as a kid in New York City that they used, when these lapel buttons were very popular, there was one that used to say, Hitler is alive and doing well in Argentina, because there were a lot of myths, and they're still going around, that Hitler actually got away from the Berlin bunker, and that he made his way down either to Argentina, some say to Brazil, others say to Chile. There's a bit of myth in all that, but when you look at the factual history, there are two U-boats, which are probably the two best known, the U-977 and the U-530, that actually landed on two beaches. One of them is called Mar del Plata, which is a very large, it's the main seaside resort on the Atlantic.
They actually beached themselves, Adrian? They just pulled up and forced themselves up? They beached themselves?
Exactly. They beached themselves. One of them is a rather larger city, so it actually stranded something like 2 miles in offshore. And the other one is a much smaller town called San Clemente del Tuyú, which is between Mar del Plata and the city of Buenos Aires. These are all beachside resorts on the Atlantic coast. And there was a lot of hush-hush about the whole thing. The Argentinian armed forces immediately went and apparently took charge of that. Now, nobody knows exactly what was on those subs. Nobody knows exactly what was unloaded from those subs. And there are eyewitness reports. We're talking about July and August 1945, which is smack in the middle of winter here. So there were not that many eyewitness reports, and there were not a lot of people on those extremely cold beaches at that time. But that people actually got off those submarines. So We don't quite know what happened, but what we do know, because very often, very often history requires you to infer things from the information, the patchy information that we have.
Sure.
What we do know is that a short time later, this was July and August 1945, a short time later, October 1945 to be exact, Argentina became sort of a political battleground between pro-American groups in Argentina and pro-British groups in Argentina, which were traditionally very strong, and a lot of pro-German forces, which surprisingly one would expect, well, they should have died down with Germany having lost the war, and yet that was not the case. So much so that there was really strong support to bring one General Juan Domingo Perón, I'm sure that name rings a bell, Evita's husband, who made a revolution on the 17th of October of 1945, and he actually, a few months later, won a landslide electoral victory and became president of Argentina for 9 years. Now, during those 9 years, he opened the doors to many German, very selectively, but to many German scientists, engineers, and intellectuals, so much so that there were certain people, rather paranoid people in America, that say, "Hey, the Fourth Reich is being prepared in Argentina," which was not the case. However, it is true that many former military and engineers did come to Argentina. They did develop and build missiles. They did develop and build fighter aircraft, jet aircraft. Actually, the first jet aircraft built in Latin America was built under the guidance of one Kurt Tank, who had worked on the Messerschmitt ME-262, which was a two-engine jet fighter at the very end of World War II. And at that time, Mr. Perón also set up the Argentine Air Force, which was founded in 1946, and that counted with the support and actually the guidance of Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, who was also a Stuka fighter, war hero.
Oh, yeah. Rudel, I think he lost half of a leg, if I'm not mistaken. The guy
he lost half of a leg, and one of my colleagues down here remembers when he was in his high school many years back that he had Hans Ulrich Rudel as one of his professors.
Wow.
And the guy used to say, "Don't worry about flying because it's a proven fact that no airplane ever got stuck up there. They all end up coming down." So that's his way of calming his students down into actually flying. Mm-hmm. So at that time, it was sort of a heyday for Argentine technology as a whole, which was very, very intimately linked with German technology. Another case is the one Ronald Richter, who actually set up a project called Project Huemul, which was on one of the lakes on the mountains in a town called Bariloche. Bariloche is the main Alp-like or skiing resort in Argentina, and he actually stated that he had been able to control fusion energy, not fission energy, where fission you take a heavy atom like uranium-235, which is enriched uranium and so forth, and you split it into two atoms. Fusion is the other way around. You take two atoms of hydrogen and you bash it into one atom of helium, and that gives off a lot of energy, actually much cleaner energy. And Mr. Ronald Richter, who was also came from Germany after the war, he said that he had been able to develop magnetic bottles to control those extremely high temperature fission reactions. Now, he was the pressure from America was so strong that Perón, well, first he was sort of coaxed into abandoning many of these projects, and Perón was finally ousted, to a great extent because of his own mistakes. Let's be very, very open about this. But he was finally ousted in 1955, and there must have been a lot going on because Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Britain at the time in September of 55, said the fact that Mr. Perón is out of power is one of the most important things that has happened to the British Empire since we won World War II.
Really?
So obviously for the Brits and for the Americans, he was a bit of a thorn, and he did raise a lot of concern. So you know, there's a whole sort of, let's say, a less known, more I won't say occult because that's not the right word, but more hidden side to history, which very often is not reported in history books, and that includes what you were just saying a few minutes ago, or in your opening remarks, Jeff, regarding the very strange mission of Admiral Richard C. Byrd. Operation High Jump, I think it was called.
Yeah, I think so. Adrian, hold on a sec, please. We have to take a break. Come right back. I'd like also to know if you know what happened to those extraordinary U-boats that beached themselves. Were they pulled free, and are they in museums down there now? And we'll find out more about that in a minute. There is a U-boat in Chicago, right downtown in the United States, and there were 100 of them that went unaccounted for at the end of the war. Goodness knows where they all ended up. All right, hold on. Back in just a minute with Adrian Salvucci live from Argentina. Okay, let's get right back to our conversation. It's always fascinating to look back at history and try to learn from it, and Adrian is the perfect man in regards to the information that comes from Argentina. What were the two U-boat numbers again?
The U-530 and the U-977. Now, they were pretty much conventional subs. They were diesel powered.
Yeah.
They were able to remain underwater for relatively extensive amounts of times, but they are a different story, or a separate story rather, from the ones that you were mentioning, which were the type U-21 and U-23, which were gigantic. Apparently, they were gigantic subs. Right. And they were built in modules, and I understand. I've read this, but I mean, this is something that some of the reports we've seen down here seem to show that they were not. They were electrical powered. So I don't know what
the German submarines at the end of the war were extraordinary. They were a generation ahead of anything else in the ocean. And technologically, as we all know, the scientists in Germany were just amazing in terms of whatever discipline they were in, and weapons, of course, were no exception. So, okay, I'm looking up 530 here, and there's quite a bit of information on it on any major search engine. So, and we've got pictures.
You get a lot of data on that on Google. But you know, one of the points that maybe I'd like to sort of mention, because it might help your listeners to do their own research actually, is that we have to see, well, you know, what is the consistency of the whole thing regarding the subs. First of all, I think we have to point out the figure of a German leader who was very non-political in a way, because it was just a military professional career.
Yeah, Dönitz.
Professional, who was Admiral Karl Dönitz.
Dönitz, yeah.
Karl Dönitz, as I mentioned before, was actually named by Hitler to be his successor, and he's the guy who signed, as I was saying, the capitulation with the Allies, I think it was in Brems in 1945. Now, prior to that,
let me say one thing. Adrian, excuse me, may I say one thing about Dönitz? Dönitz was, as I have said for years, including people like Albert Speer, the successor. And there would have been a successor to Hitler whose health was failing, and Germany would have moderated. There's no question about it. The excesses of the Third Reich under Hitler would have passed. This is just the way the political pendulum works. Dönitz was a competent military man. In fact, some call him a genius. He was in charge of the submarine forces and the Navy. But beyond that, he understood how to deal at the level at which he was appointed to succeed the Führer. Also, I should point out that 90+% of the German submariners in World War II never came back to port. They died.
And I think that ties in with the 100 subs that even the Americans have tried to search for them all over the place, and they actually finally never found them. Now, Karl Dönitz, which I think you just described very well from the political point of view, they would have been a much more moderate, more professionalized group of people taking or succeeding the original leadership, which happens with every revolution. You have the revolutionaries,
everyone,
all the dramatic work, and then more moderate people. Even in America, if you look at the revolutionaries from the American Revolutionary War, well, more moderate people came after they were. Now, Dönitz actually succeeded Admiral Raeder, who was in charge also of the Kriegsmarine. And the interesting thing about the history of Dönitz is that he was one of the key officers in charge of a very far-reaching expedition, and this ties in with Admiral Byrd, back in 1935, 36, and 37 to Antarctica, which is south of Argentina. As we all know, it's the white continent, of which Argentina lays a theoretic or hypothetical territorial claim because we have absolutely no power and no clout to uphold it. But throughout the years, we have upheld that there is a sector of Antarctica, together with Chile and Britain and France and New Zealand and a couple of the states, which also laid territorial claims. And back in 35, 36, and 37, the German Navy, actually, with Raeder and with Dönitz, sent an expedition to Antarctica, and they actually claimed an entire sector of Antarctica and called it Neuschwabenland. New Swabia would be the translation of it. Now, the funny thing is that nobody really knows exactly what was done there, and there were many, many rumors that a sizable part of German scientists, perhaps some German political leaders, I don't know if it was Hitler, if it wasn't Hitler, or whatever, maybe it's not even important, and definitely a lot of the results of their technological inventions and developments actually boarded those gigantic Type U-21 and Type U-23 modular subs and made it to Antarctica. Now, those rumors, one would say, well, maybe they're far-fetched, but it does tend to explain why America in 1947, in the summer down here in the southern hemisphere, in January of 1947, smack in the middle of summer down in the South Atlantic, why they sent Mr. Byrd with a veritable war fleet. I mean, Admiral Richard C. Byrd's fleet from January 1947, American admiral actually, it was an aircraft carrier, the Philippine Seas. It included the Mount Olympus cruiser. It included 3 destroyers, icebreakers, even a submarine, war aircraft, and 10,000 troops. Now, why would America send 10,000 troops, a veritable invasion force, to Antarctica in 1947? Now, they were supposed to be there for 6 months, and something happened. We never quite knew why, but Admiral Byrd cut his mission short and went back to America in February of 1947. The interesting thing...
Do we know the casualty figures of that particular strange expeditionary force that was done? Were there losses?
I think it's something we can. It's interesting to point out after the break.
We'll have to speculate because it's still, I guess, wrapped in secrecy officially.
Yeah.
All right, hold on. Back with Adrian in just a couple of minutes as we look at post-World War II history. Very interesting. Look up Admiral Byrd's mission to the Antarctic in 1948. 48, yes?
1947.
47, okay. Be right back. Hang on. Okay, and we're back talking with Adrian Salbucci about Germany and Argentina before and after and during the war. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, just during the break, I was looking here through a book I have that was actually written by a German who died recently. A friend of mine, he came from Germany after the war, an 87-year-old man. And he reproduces in his book on some of the secret, it's in Spanish actually, some of the secret weapons that Germany had towards the end of the war. He gives a facsimile reproduction of an article that appeared on the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio. Mercurio is like the New York Times for America, well, El Mercurio is for Chile. Mm-hmm. It's more than 150-year-old, very important newspaper. It's dated Wednesday, 5th March 1947. And the headline says, Admiral Richard E. Byrd referred to the strategic importance of the poles. And then he goes on to give an interview made by radio on board the Mount Olympus on the high seas, which was Admiral Byrd's main ship where he was stationed. And he said that it is, and I'm quoting, that it is essential that the United States adopt measures of protection to avoid a possible invasion by aircraft emanating from the southern pole. And then he goes on to say that the next war that America will have to face may involve aircraft that can easily fly from the poles at extremely high speeds. Now, this later just disappeared. This just went completely off the news, and I think they said that Admiral Byrd was batty or something like that. But, it is like, when you try to put together the jigsaw puzzle, it all starts to make sense, because you had the Germans setting something up in the 1930s, before the war, actually, 1935, 36, 37. And you also had Admiral Dönitz saying towards the end of the war, when things were getting really desperate in Germany, that the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, had actually set up an invulnerable fortress in a very far-off place in the world, where the key leadership and the key scientists and the key intellectuals could go and take refuge, even if Germany's plight were to really become desperate, as it then did in 1945. And that also ties in, Jeff, with the Perón government, because Chile never had a pro-German government. Chile has always traditionally been extremely pro-Britain, and they are to this very day, and they've always been very consistent about that. The problem child down here is us Argentinians. We've always wavered one way and the other. And the Perón government, which actually started in 1946, but he had been vice president to a government that started in 1943, was very much pro-German. Actually, Argentina only declared war on Germany in March of 1945, less than 6 weeks before Germany capitulated, as an agreement with Germany, so that the Argentinian government could confiscate German property here. Otherwise, the Americans would have done that. So it was even done to help German interests. There were many German companies down here. Now, probably what Perón did not quite realize was he was really playing with fire, because this was not just a regular country that was overcome militarily. There was much, much more behind that. And when you look at this, I often wonder, why has there been such huge hysteria on the part of the Americans in particular, but you also find it on the part of the Europeans, to really give everything relating to the Third Reich, not just its leadership, Mr. Hitler and Mr. Himmler and Mr. Goebbels and so forth, but even the symbols of the Third Reich, such a gigantically demonic and satanic and horrendous public image, so much so that nowadays people see a swastika or they see a photo of Hitler and they just go, oh my God, it's the devil and this and that. And I often wonder, does this tie in with the psychological warfare that's been emanating from Hollywood for 60 years now, whereby they are telling us there are UFOs in the sky, they appeared after World War II, but they're all Martians. There are the good Martians or bad Martians or green Martians or whatever, because that is something that global public opinion and even American public opinion today has been programmed to accept. I mean, people would accept if they were to say tomorrow, okay, yeah, there are UFOs and they come from Mars or whatever. But how would they be able to present to public opinion that many of those aircraft are actually technology from the Third Reich that did not capitulate to the Americans or the Russians or the French, and they're still out there and they can still do whatever they want?
Well, it's a fascinating concept. I don't know. He went down there for a very serious reason. This cost a lot of money, and there were casualties. It is said that airplanes took off and vanished, and he basically went scurrying away with his tail between his legs. I'm not telling you this for a fact. I'm telling you this is what I've heard from people. We don't know. Something was going on down there, or he wouldn't have made the trip. This was a huge deal.
Exactly, and it goes back to what you were saying before. I have never actually been able to ascertain if how many of his troops died or if any ship was sunk. I have read that he lost aircraft. No ships were lost, and that obviously, having lost aircraft, he also lost some troops. Now, as you're aptly saying, he must have seen something that said, whoops, we better go back home, in a way. And it probably has a lot to do, because you see, this is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. As you put the pieces together, a lot of things start to fall into place. It probably might have a lot to do with the fact that the Germans were working on two parallel technological developments. On the one hand, conventional weaponry, in other words, well, the rockets, the Werner von Braun's, the Peenemünde, and the jet aircraft, which were the plans. Actually, there were 3 aircraft. The jet aircraft plans, the Messerschmitt plans, were actually captured by the Russians, or the Soviets rather, the Americans, and a lot of them got to Argentina through Kurt Tank, That's why the first fighter aircraft were so similar, all three amongst each other, because they were all based on the same basic German plan.
Right.
But that technology is basically the technology which is extant, or which is in force today throughout the world. What we can call explosive technology. In other words, you make things explode, and that is exothermic chemical reactions, very centrifugal, and it tends to, well, it generates a lot of energy, whether it be internal combustion engines or gas or turbines or whatever. But they seem to have also developed what they themselves called implosive technology, which were technologies that instead of giving off energy, they actually absorbed energy. They were centripetal instead of centrifugal. They were endothermic instead of exothermic, and they tended to integrate instead of making things explode. In other words, they were more negentropic than entropic. In other words, they did not release energy; they would actually take in energy.
Got it.
And that might explain some of the round craft that were seen in the sky. And actually, plans have been found. I don't know if they are authentic or not, but they look very authentic.
Well, the
SS is developing these aircraft.
Correct. The whole story of German flying saucers and flying discs is an enormous one, and it is one of the well-kept secrets of the war, of course. Maybe the best-kept secret of all. The truth is, they probably did perfect flying discs in the early 40s. The truth is, those discs and that technology were probably moved away. There are stories of people who were kept in barracks, and if they even stuck their nose out the window, they were shot to death. They could hear these incredible noises of these craft as they powered up and took off. So, I mean, we've got a lot of eyewitnesses and a lot of other material as well. Okay, back with Adrian, and we're talking about history. All right, my friend, go right ahead, please.
Yeah, we were just talking about the going on down in Antarctica, and one of the things that I was mentioning is that there are actually they've been recovered, they've been published in different books, especially down in our region, in Chile and in Argentina, in books that are only available in Spanish, regrettably. The actual plans of what these disc-like vehicles actually look like. There was one series called Haunebu, and apparently they built the Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, and Series 4, and when you look at the actual specifications, these were all done by the Ahnenerbe at the SS, which was the section in the SS, the Black Force that actually studied all the very ancient technologies and traditions.
Well,
some of them
you're really up on this. You know your history. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, some of them had speeds of 7, 8, 10,000 miles an hour, and they were described as Raumfähig, which in German means they can go out into outer space. So, I mean, these are things incredible. And then there were two smaller versions, which were called the Vril 1 and Vril 2. Now, you say, what's Vril? Vril is supposedly a special psychic energy about which an Englishman by the name of Sir Edward Bulwer-Lytton described in a book called The Coming Race back at the end of the 19th century, which tied in with Edgar Allan Poe, because, this is part of the thread, our Ariadne's thread, which will get us through the labyrinth. It ties in with Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote an incredible fiction story, I think it's the narrative of Francis Gordon Pym, which takes place in Antarctica. And that was picked up by another great American writer called H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote a book called At the Mountains of Madness, which also talks about something very funny discovered in Antarctica. So why do I say this? Because I don't think the Germans, the Germans in the Third Reich obviously did a lot of very extremely interesting things on the scientific and technological level, but I don't think that they were necessarily a master race who picked up and were able to do in just 12 years what nobody else could do. There are many indications that perhaps what they were able to do is contact very ancient lodges who may have had these technologies in the waiting for millennia, and for some reason or another, they might have said, well, let's see if the Germans can do something useful with it, which they didn't. And they lost the war, and they probably deserved to lose the war because of all their excesses and so forth. But there is like a hidden secret thread, Ariadne's thread, that might get us through the labyrinth to start to understand what may really have happened. And as I say, to explain this hysteria, whereby the symbols of the Third Reich and so forth are, well, they're banned, they're prohibited, because obviously there is something in there that still keeps Americans or the Israelis or the Brits or the Russians wide awake at night, very worried.
Yeah, I would think. Do you suppose Go ahead.
No. Can I very briefly mention one of my favorite cases?
Please.
It refers to a 1990s movie, which I'm sure a lot of you, well, I'm sure you've seen it, I've seen it, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have seen it, called Contact. You remember Contact with Jodie Foster? Didn't
see it, but I remember it, yes.
It's a hell of a good movie, and it's based on a real-life story of a lady who used to direct the SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, in America, with radio telescopes and so forth. Now, there's a scene in that movie, because Jodie Foster, who plays this character, she actually receives a signal from a star, vague, I think it is, like 20, 30 light years away, which has information. It's actually a highly modulated, at a very specific frequency and so forth. So she makes the announcement, and it's automatically declared national security. Even President Clinton is made to indirectly announce this. They very cleverly use some real footage to put Clinton in there. And when the actor who plays the national security advisor comes into her installations, he brings in all the military. They come in, and they're fully armed, and Jodie Foster tells this guy, hey, this is a civilian project. Why don't you tell your military men to move away? And the guy sort of looks at her and says, okay, and they back off. When they demodulate this signal, which is the first signal coming from outer space, and they put it through a TV screen, and they adjust it and readjust it, what's the first thing they see? Adolf Hitler announcing the 1936 Olympics. Why? Because... But the explanation is, it was the first TV signal broadcast. It went out into outer space, and what this superior civilization are doing is merely sending it back to us, like saying, yeah, I can hear you, how are you too? So, but when the image of Hitler appears with the swastika and so forth, the guy playing the part of the national security advisor who had told the military to back off, he calls them back in again into the room. Now, I think there's a very subtle message in there from Hollywood, or even more so from Carl Sagan, because the novel Contact was written by Carl Sagan, who was a CFR member and died a short time afterwards. There's a subtle message in there saying, hey, maybe the stuff that we are putting or branding as Martians and little green men, maybe it's something that did not capitulate in Berlin in 1945. It's something that did get away, and they are able to put their aircraft all over the bloody planet, do whatever they want, and apparently they're down in Antarctica or thereabouts, and for some reason when Argentinians or Chileans misbehave and have governments or make declarations which might even be remotely construed as being favorable to or promoting what happened in those years in Europe, well, we have to, squash them and completely disqualify them.
Fascinating. Yeah, there is so much. Schauberger, a genius.
Yes, Schauberger. Well, he was one of the guys who, it was his theories that were used for these implosion technologies.
Yeah, and M-I-E-T-H-E, Mita, I think. I've forgotten how to pronounce his name. Another one.
Exactly, Mita, and the other one was the converter called the Kohler converter, K-O-H-L-E-R,
right.
which they basically seem to use something which is very similar to Tesla technology, because we have to bring Nikola Tesla into this. And, if things start having you start getting a very different picture of all these things, which obviously no official textbook and no official history will ever let you delve into. By the way, the fact that I think also explains the what I call, and I hope I don't offend anybody, the Holocaust myth, in a sense, because it has been exaggerated and positioned so hugely and so enormously that it automatically acts as a barrier which makes sure that nobody will make any serious inquiries into other things that happened in the Third Reich, which had nothing to do with the Jews, the concentration camps, war, or violence. For example, their monetary system, something that nobody wants to discuss, and it worked very well. And, for example, these alternative technologies, which they obviously developed, and, and even very strangely, they had developed them, and yet they did not use them to make Germany win the war, because that part of the SS, the Ahnenerbe, who studied all these millennia-old traditions, they were probably fed up with their political leadership, and they, for some reason, maybe they were even banned from doing that, they did not use those technologies to help Germany win the war. In fact, they probably lost their credibility.
Most likely, yeah. This issue of the spoils of war was never more appropriate and absolutely essential to World War II in terms of what the West and the East were fighting for. Germany was the world leader in technology, and to get in there and to grab as much of it as possible was of course the big race. That's why most Germans tried to surrender to the West. They knew what was coming. They'd be forced to labor the rest of their lives with their scientific knowledge and their technical expertise. Werner von Braun came over here, and one of the last things von Braun said in warning to his assistant, Carol Rosen, who was a friend of mine and others, she was told by von Braun that the Illuminati, or a very special group of elite, were going to eventually play the E.T. invasion card to finally force the planet Earth, the sheep, to submit to control. They were going to say, we're under attack, we have to put all these weapons in space, and then they're going to stage the attack somehow. Now, they may have the technology to do that already. We don't know. But we do know there are geosynchronous satellites up in orbit, 18,000, 20,000 miles out, and all they do is watch the comings and goings of craft to this planet. We're being visited all the time. So we can have this fake E.T. attack. It won't be E.T. Any time at all. I mean, we are in that kind of control mode.
Yeah, that's why, in one of the videos that I prepared back at the end of 2009, I mentioned that one of the triggers that they might use, as you are so aptly describing, is a reality show involving a false E.T. attack or contact, which will help them to justify and tell everybody, you see, we have to have one unified representation with the universe. So again, we need world government, and they will be able to do that. And the technologies do exist. A lot of people miss the fact that on the day that Obama was elected president, 4th of November of 2008, CNN had Wolf Blitzer in his New York studio, the CNN New York studio, actually having a conversation with a hologram of another reporter called Judith Yellen, who was in Chicago, but her image, her three-dimensional image, was projected into the New York studio, and the camera would move around so that you could tell that it was Wolf Blitzer and Judith Yellen three-dimensionally speaking, but he was in New York and she was in Chicago. So that's the only time I think they've done that on television, and in a way it's a way of saying, hey, we can do this.
Well, they did it, they showed it, and it is all doable. And what we see is, of course, just a smattering of what the military continues to hide and use. We're given hand-me-downs, and by the time we get to know officially what they are doing with our tax money, it has been 20 years ago, in many, or more, in many cases. Adrian, thank you. This has been fascinating, and the idea, of course, of UFOs and strange events of high strangeness over Argentina, from cattle mutilations, you name it, to landings and reports of all kinds of craft continue to dominate ufology around the world. So let us know, and maybe we'll do a program in ufology sometime. That would be fun.
Wonderful. It'll be my pleasure. I'll investigate some more stuff, and I'll pass the word on to you through the email, and I'm always here whenever you need.
Great. I'm amazed at your historical knowledge, Adrian. Thank you very much for sharing it.
Thank you, and good evening. Take care.
You too. Adrian Salvucci, live from Argentina. All right, there's hour 2 for you. We'll be right back.